or by attacking its nuclear sites and its military targets. The idea of attacking Iran was never limited simply to the Iranian nuclear targets. It was always to weaken Iran as a potential power in the Middle East, regardless of what happened in its nuclear program. So there is a long-standing strategic objective on the part of a series of Israeli governments to try to maneuver the U.S. government into a policy of attacking Iran so that the problem of the future of Iran as a rival to Israel in the Middle East could be taken care of. Now, of course, when we go to the Bush administration in 2001 to 2009, we know that there were senior officials in the Bush administration who were not only sympathetic to that Israeli aim, but who actively promoted that within the Bush administration. And of course, this was primarily led by none other than Vice President Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney surrounded himself with a set of advisors who included David Wormser, who was a signatory of the infamous report called A Clean Break, which advised then Prime Minister Netanyahu to attack, to use military force to bring down the Syrian regime and ultimately to go after the Iraqi regime as well, in order to set up a situation where Israel and the United States more completely dominated the Middle East and, of course, by implication, would be in a position then to bring about regime change in Iran as well. Netanyahu, fortunately, did not accept the advice of the authors of that report, but from 2003 to 2007, David Wormser was advising Vice President Cheney, and he was part of a coterie of officials, of advisors, who were plotting a strategy for bringing about a U.S. war, a use of military force against Iran. In my book, I document the fact that John Bolton was a part of a strategy that was carried out in collaboration with the Israeli government to set up a set of false accusations about an alleged Iranian covert nuclear weapons program. It was Bolton who led that effort. He's the one who began to accuse Iran publicly in 2004 of now actively at that point having a covert nuclear weapons program. He tried to get the IAEA to pick up the false accusation in 2004 that Iran had a covert nuclear weapons program. He was hoping that the Iranians would refuse to allow the IAEA to go to the Parchin military facility, which the IAEA requested because of Bolton's pressure. Unfortunately for Bolton, the Iranians did allow the IAEA to visit Parchin twice in 2005, knowing that they wouldn't find anything. They allowed the IAEA to visit 10 different sites at Parchin, 10 sites that the IAEA itself chose after it arrived at the base, the Parchin military facility, on 2 occasions. And of course, they took environmental samples and found nothing. But the point here is that Bolton and Cheney were clearly dedicated to a strategy that would ultimately involve a U.S. attack on Iran. It was to follow the invasion and conquest of Iraq. Once the United States consolidated its control over Iraq, then the use of military force, the threat of force, the use of force to carry out regime change throughout the rest of the Middle East would resume, and Iran would be the ultimate target. So Israel's policy of maneuvering the United States into a position of attacking Iran reached its apogee during the Bush administration. We now know, of course, that it failed, first of all, because the U.S. military was unable to consolidate its control over Iraq, and secondly, in part because of that, the U.S. military and the Pentagon were wholeheartedly opposed to a war against Iran. They demanded to know how this was going to end up, and they were basically able to sit on this and make it go away. They were able to prevent Cheney from carrying through his plan in 2007. So then the Obama administration came into office, supposedly committed to diplomacy rather than to war. But unfortunately, something happened with the Obama administration that we still see today is a very serious problem with regard to this threat to kill the Iran nuclear agreement. And that is that the Obama administration bought into the false argument that the Bush administration was making throughout the period from 2003 certainly to 2009, that Iran was pursuing covertly a nuclear weapons program. The Obama administration agreed that the Iranians had indeed tried to get nuclear weapons, and that was a premise that they continued to act upon throughout the period before the diplomacy really began, before the negotiations with the Iranians began in 2013, and then even during the negotiations. The Obama administration repeatedly voiced this premise that we know that Iran wants to get nuclear weapons. We know that they have tried to get nuclear weapons. And we are going to put pressure on the Iranians to stop their pursuit of nuclear weapons. And we're going to do that, they announced, by the pressure of sanctions, economic and financial sanctions against Iran, which they hoped would force Iran to give up entirely its enrichment program. That was the aim, originally, of the economic sanctions. Well, that, of course, ultimately failed. It failed in 2012, it failed in 2013, and by 2014, the Obama administration had admitted that it was not going to work and that they were going to have to actually negotiate with Iran. And that's why we have gotten this agreement, because the sanctions failed to force Iran to do what the Obama administration was determined to force Iran to do, which was to give up its nuclear program entirely, except for the most token program that would be totally meaningless from the Iranian point of view. So from 2014 to last month, the Obama administration pursued those negotiations, and we now have this agreement, which is so important as a break against the pressure for war with Iran. Because during those negotiations, the Israeli government's strategy, the Netanyahu government's strategy, was to plant one poison pill after another in the U.S. negotiating position. And I've written a number of articles from 2012 through 2015, up to 2015, which documents the ways in which the Israelis tried to inject demands that they knew the Iranians would reject, and which they hoped very much would cause the breakdown of the negotiations. For example, the Israelis tried to get the Obama administration to demand the complete closure of Fordo, the second enrichment site that the Iranians opened in 2010. And the Obama administration actually embraced that position, that demand, for a long time. The Obama administration did, in fact, try to force Iran to agree to close the Fordo site. Ultimately, in the more recent phase of the negotiations, the Obama administration was forced to abandon that demand. Another demand that the Israelis introduced, another poison pill, was the demand that Iran had to make a full confession of the supposed covert nuclear weapons activities that they had carried out from 2001 to 2003 or even later. And now this, of course, was certain to be a deal breaker because the Iranians would never agree that they should make a confession to activities that they absolutely denied from the very beginning they had carried out. And ultimately, again, the Obama administration abandoned that demand. And in fact, when I was in Vienna for the final stage of the negotiations, I was given an account of how that issue, which was called the possible military dimensions, PMD, the possible military dimensions of the Iranian nuclear program, was finally resolved. And what was explained to me by Iranian officials was that that Kerry made it clear to Yukiya Amano, the Director General of the IAEA, that he was to come to a final assessment of the Iranian cooperation on this issue at the same time that the rest of the Iranian commitments were to be verified by the IAEA. In other words, by October 15th, the Iranians were to finish their cooperation, and by December 15th, the IAEA, Amano himself, would present his assessment, which would then make it possible to lift the sanctions against Iran. So in other words, Amano was told in no uncertain terms, this issue is to be resolved. This is the only way we're going to get a deal, and your role is to finish this off before the end of the year. So the point really here is that the Israelis did their best to sabotage the negotiations throughout the entire course of the negotiations. The Obama administration, once they became serious about the negotiations, understood that they would have to abandon one Israeli demand after another. And in the end, that's why the Israelis understood that the only way that they were going to be able to stop this agreement would be to get Congress to defeat it. And of course, in the final stage of the negotiations, we saw the Republicans carry out an operation which again was closely coordinated by AIPAC to put forward legislation that would be aimed at defeating the agreement. Ultimately, they were forced to compromise with the administration, and the result was a piece of legislation which would not achieve the aim that the Israeli lobby had in mind. But that was indeed the original aim that the Israeli government and the Israeli lobby had in mind for Congress. So now we are at the point where the campaign is ready to try to defeat the agreement by blanketing 30 to 40 states with enormously expensive ad buys to create an atmosphere in which large numbers of congressmen, members of Congress, and senators will be exposed to day after day of propaganda to argue that the agreement is a threat to the interests of the United States. And I have to tell you that